7 days ago, I was eating 4 waterproofs and a pair of wellies. Because we had a rather bad leak coming down this wall with a massive flood. We had to turn the whole thing round, facing the other direction last Sunday. So I'm pleased to be able to be dry and standing here this morning. Let's pray. Jesus, we say there is no other name but the name of Jesus. And we say you reign above it all. It also says in your word that your works are achieved not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit. And we pray, Lord, for your Spirit. Thank you that you have given that so freely to us. We just pray, Lord, that this morning we just meet you in a fresh way. In Jesus' name, amen. So far in the series of encounters with Jesus, we've been reminded of the impact that Jesus makes when he meets ordinary people, and sometimes with mostly with extraordinary outcomes. And this morning we're looking at a unique encounter because it was a real first. We're familiar with the phrase, there's a first time for everything. And of course there is. And I sort of kind of started thinking about firsts and famous firsts, and I thought it'd be good this morning just to get you, test your general knowledge a little bit and get you thinking. Okay? So I've got a few firsts here that I'd like you to help me with. Do you know the first person who discovered antibiotics? So you medics in the room. Does anybody know the first person to discover antibiotics?
Jenna. Was it Jenna?
It's not Jenna, but it's a good guess. Alexander Fleming is the right answer. Nearly 100 years ago, 1928. You didn't know you were going to get a quiz this morning. And what about the first British female Prime Minister? We've had a female Prime Minister recently, but what about the first one? The Iron Lady, Margaret Thatcher. Somehow we remember her, don't we? She became Prime Minister in 1974. And then coming closer to home, what about the first British woman in space? Helen Sharman, of Sheffield's very own Helen Sharman. And Alison actually has a claim to fame as far as Helen Sharman's concerned, don't you?
I do. She was my next door but neighbour, which is why I know the answer.
And not only that, but we went to the same school.
We went to school.
So Helen Sharman got into space in 1991, and
It wasn't anything to do with things.
and she wasn't in the same school the year either. Alison was much younger. So today we're looking at Mary Magdalene, and Mary was one of Jesus' closest friends. She was right in the heart of Jesus' ministry. And she was there when Jesus died, and she was also the first person to witness the resurrected Jesus. So let's look at the story in John's Gospel. Chapter 20, verses 1 to 18. So early on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. And she said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we don't know where they've put it." Peter and the other disciples started out from the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. Mary was standing outside the tomb, crying, and as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw 2 white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her. "Because they've taken away my Lord," she replied, "and I don't know where they've put him." She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener. "Sir," she said, "if you've taken him away, tell me where you've put him, and I'll go and get him." "Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out, "Rabboni," which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But go find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Let's take a quick look at Mary Magdalene's backstory. There are quite a few Marys in the Bible, and in the Gospels particularly. Dave was talking about one last week, Martha's sister. But this is not entirely surprising, as Mary was the most single popular name among Hebrew Jews, Palestinian Jews at the time, born by about 1 in 4 women. And I think we've got 1 or 2 names knocking around the manual that's a bit like that, isn't it? We've got a few Hannahs, I think, haven't we? But this Mary was distinguished by the place that she'd come from, a place in Galilee called Magdalene. And we first read about her in Luke chapter 8, where she's mentioned as one in a group of women who were using their time and whatever resources they had to keep Jesus and his disciples on the road as they visited villages and towns. That might not sound particularly strange to us, but in Hebrew culture it would have been unusual for women to have such a prominent role in the ministry of any rabbi. So why would these women have been so committed and engaged with Jesus' ministry? We're told that they'd been cured of evil spirits and diseases, and Jesus had cast out 7 demons from Mary alone. These strongholds in Mary's life would have been fiercely opposing all that Jesus was offering, preventing her from entering into a new life. She was bound up and held captive, and Jesus deals with this decisively. With these demonic strongholds broken, the addictions, the illnesses, the fears, the hopelessness, whatever it was, they're gone. She's joyous, she's free, and now she just wants to be close to the person who set her free. That didn't change for the whole of Jesus' ministry. Mary was right in the middle of things when Jesus was crucified. All 4 Gospels make reference to her being there at Golgotha. Mary would have watched the torment and suffering at the hands of the Roman soldiers, egged on by the Jewish leaders and the mob mentality of all the people there that were baying for his blood. She was at the foot of the cross when he finally died. She was there all the way. So we pick up the story with Mary going to the tomb early on Sunday morning. But why would she have been doing this? There are probably a few reasons. Perhaps the most pressing consideration was that the actual burial, when Jesus was buried, had been really hurried, and some commentators suggest that the body had not been properly prepared in line with Jewish custom. You'll remember that Joseph and Nicodemus had taken control of the body and wrapped the body in a shroud, covering the face with a special cloth. But this had happened at the end of the day, just before the beginning of Shabbat, the Sabbath, where work was forbidden under Hebrew law. Mary and a few other women had seen the tomb where Jesus had been laid and had decided to return after the Sabbath in the hope that maybe they would be able to anoint Jesus' body with spices and ointments. There were obvious practical reasons for doing this in a hot climate, but more than anything, this would have served as a symbolic expression of their devotion to Jesus. And that leads us probably on to the simplest and most obvious reason why they were there. Mary loved Jesus. She just wanted to be around where she had last seen his body laid to rest. And we probably all relate to that. when we lose somebody we love, there's a special place or a special memory, or there's a place we go back to. Mary was grieving, she was devastated. And so you can just imagine the urgency Mary had on that Sunday morning to get to the tomb as fast as she could. And she got there early on that Sunday morning. But there was always doubt. There was also doubt as she made her way there. Mary knew she'd need help to move the stone away to access Jesus' body. And who's going to be around in the dark first thing in the morning? You see, in order to protect the tomb, this huge piece of stone was placed at the entrance, was usually positioned on a ramp, which meant that closing the stone and closing the tomb would have been relatively easy, but pushing the stone up a ramp would have taken several people to achieve. So Mary arrives at the tomb, and it's still dark. And she sees straight away that the stone has been moved away. Mary wasn't expecting an empty tomb. Mary, along with the other disciples, had heard Jesus repeatedly talk about his resurrection, but it hadn't sunk in. There's loads of exchanges in Mark's Gospel, particularly, and chapter 9 says this. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise." But they didn't understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him about it. Jesus couldn't have been more explicit. You can imagine her immediate response: panic, confusion. Her mind is spinning with so many questions. Who's taken the body? What have they done with the body? What should I do now? Who can help me? And we read Mary runs to find two of the other disciples, Peter and John, who race to the tomb, finding just the strips of linen lying there undisturbed. And as soon as John sees the evidence, it says that he believes. For him, at least, the penny is starting to drop. John must have remembered what Jesus had said and realized at that very moment that he was witnessing Jesus' resurrection. So they went back to the other disciples to tell them what they'd seen. And so now we come back to Mary. And the others have gone, and she's left at the empty tomb weeping. Not only has Mary endured Jesus' death, but his body's missing, and she's no idea what's happened. She's distraught and confused, and even her mourning has been violated. Whilst the penny may have dropped for John, Mary's still looking for the body. Amongst the tears, she bends forwards to look in the tomb. She's taken Peter and John's word for it up until now. Was she double-checking? That maybe Jesus was there after all? You can imagine her mind whizzing round 1,000,000 miles an hour. But what does she see? 2 angels dressed in white sitting where Jesus' body had laid. And first they ask her, why is she weeping? And then she turns to step out of the tomb and she sees Jesus, but doesn't recognize him. And Jesus then asks her the same question. Woman, why do you weep? Who are you looking for? There's an implied challenge in Jesus' words. Mary's problem, in common with all the disciples, and definitely me, and possibly you, was that she just did not hold a large enough view of Jesus. She's searching for a body instead of expecting to find a victorious, risen Jesus. And so there's some application here for us. Is your view of Jesus big enough? Mary was not expecting to see Jesus alive. She was looking to tend to the body and weep in her sorrow. Do we sometimes forget that we are in a relationship with a risen Jesus? Do we settle for less than he's promised? I was really struck by the teaching Wendy Mann did. I'm sorry, but I keep going on about this, but it was really good. And it was during one of our lockdown Zoom meetings. And she was talking about how we end up dumbing down our expectation of what God can do And that's often based on our disappointments, where we haven't seen God show up when we thought he should. Wendy urges us to pray in line with what we know about God's character and his promises over us, and to take our disappointments to him. That really hit me because I realised that is exactly what I had done, dumbing down my expectations, having a reduced view of Jesus, forgetting I'm in a relationship with the risen Jesus. This affects everything: my outlook, my expectations, my behaviour, my hope for the future, how I face difficulties, everything. Romans 8 says, it stands to reason, doesn't it, that if the alive and present God who raised Jesus from the dead moves into your life, he'll do the same thing in you that he did in Jesus, bringing you alive to himself. When God lives and breathes in you, and he does as surely as he did in Jesus, you are delivered from that dead life. With his spirit living in you, your body will be as alive as Christ. That is quite a statement, but that is the truth we're dealing with, folks. Let us be people who not only believe in the risen Jesus, but know his spirit living and breathing in us, delivered from our dead life, and our bodies made alive as Christ. So we're back in the garden, and Mary replies to Jesus' question, thinking he was the gardener. Mister, if you've taken him, tell me where you put him, and I'll go and get him. You'll remember that Jesus had talked about the sheep knowing the shepherd's voice in John 10. It says the gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. So Jesus breaks into Mary's heart with a simple word: Mary. One word which remade Mary's world at that moment. Mary realizes it's Jesus the moment he calls her by name. You can imagine Mary's reaction. It must have just been too much. She's faced with her Jesus, resurrected and standing in front of her. This exchange so strongly demonstrates the importance Jesus attaches to us being known by name. Faith in Jesus is personal. Jesus knows and calls each one of us by name. Just take a moment to let that truth sink in. Jesus calls you by name because he loves you. He chose you. He accepts you. It doesn't matter how anyone else defines you. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are saying to you. What matters is that God knows you and he knows your name. This is a powerful truth, and you can see the impact it had on Mary. That moment was never going to be met with a polite handshake or an elbow bump. No, she would have run into his arms and hugged him like she would never let him go. So Jesus' response might sound strange in the circumstances. Why would Jesus say, "Don't cling to me"? It sounds like a rebuff. Poor Mary, after everything she's been through, of course she wants to embrace him. She can't quite believe her eyes. Jesus is standing right in front of her. But Jesus is indicating that a change has taken place. And he wants Mary to understand this right from the off. The crux of it is that the resurrection is going to change things for the better. Jesus was not returning to his old life. Understandably, Mary was reacting as though things were like they were before. But hard as it was for her to see it right there and there, the relationship was going to be better in the future. Jesus was about to ascend to the Father, and the Holy Spirit would be given to people around the world so we could have access to him. The resurrection changes everything. This is the same Jesus, but it's not the same Jesus. He meets his disciples behind locked doors where they can touch him. He's not a ghost. He eats in front of them to prove it. But he's appeared in a locked room. The linen grave clothes were lying flat, not thrown off, as if the body had escaped without disturbing anything. The stone had been rolled away, not to let Jesus out, but to let Mary and the disciples see that he wasn't there anymore. So the resurrected Jesus is the same, but he's not the same. And whilst we don't have much time to go into this now, the Bible encourages us to view our future in the same way. As one day having resurrected bodies and living in a new heaven and a renewed earth, where he will take our weak mortal bodies and change them into glorious bodies like his own. Where we are the same, but not the same. Jesus redeeming us, giving us new life. What a prospect that is. So as we draw to a close, there were just a couple of things that I felt God was bringing to the surface. These two questions. Is our view of Jesus big enough? And do you know that Jesus has called you by name? So we're going to be sharing communion together, and it would be really good to ask God if either of these apply to you. In relation to the first question, have you allowed disappointment to reduce your expectations of Jesus? Do you need a fresh encounter with the risen Jesus? And what about the second question? Are you struggling with identity? Do you know that you are chosen by name? That you're accepted, that you're loved by the risen Jesus?